In a county where the magnolias smother their own scent and the river keeps every secret it swallows, there's a house with a clock that refuses to strike 12. Folks say it as because midnight never ended there, it just stood up, walked the halls, and made itself at home. Tonight we're opening a door most people nail shut. If it's your first time on Tales Never Told, tell us where you're watching from and brace yourself. This is not the version polite history serves with sugar. This is the one that breathes after the candles go out. The Cawthorn place sat back from the road like a thought no one wanted to finish. White columns, black shadows, a veranda that listened. Inside lived Master Nathaniel Cawthorn, a planter who liked his ledgers balanced and his silences obedient. And his wife, Margaret Lace at the throat, iron under it, who kept the house correct the way a tight shoe keeps a foot quiet. In the scullery, hands worked that no ledger could count. Aunt Morell with her herb jars, 2 boys with quick feet and slower names, and a girl they called Eden because someone said she was untouched, and some men like to name a place before they ruin it. On the last night of June, the air fat with heat and hornet buzz, the big clock in the front hall hiccuped at 11:59 and just held. The house waited. In the parlor, the mistress folded a shawl that didn't need folding. On the landing, the master adjusted a cuff he'd already adjusted. Downstairs, Aunt Morell stopped humming mid-note and put her palm flat to the kitchen table as if feeling for tremors that belonged to memory, not earth. A bell rang once, not the supper bell, the little brass one the mistress used when she didn't want to shout. Eden heard it and felt her ribs turn to birdcage. She stood by the pantry door, apron starch crackling faint as frost, and fixed her eyes on a knot in the wood so she wouldn't have to look at the staircase. Aunt Morell reached for her wrist, gentle, and found only air. Some kinds of fear move you without your permission. "Bring the girl," came the mistress's voice, soft, level, a sentence laid out like silver on Sunday. "The master has asked." Upstairs, a door unlatched with a velvet click. The house took a breath. Eden swallowed once, then again. She wasn't naive. Innocence doesn't survive in ledger books. But she was young, and the word bed sounded bigger than the room it meant. Aunt Morell stepped between Eden and the hall. Not a wall, a pause. "You walk where your feet can carry you back from," she murmured. "Keep your eyes." Dante, hand them over. She pressed a sprig of something green into Eden's palm, bitter on the tongue if you chewed it, sweet if you lived long enough to tell it. "Midnight," the mistress corrected from the shade of the staircase. He asked for midnight. Only the clock wouldn't grant it. The long hand trembled at the 8, the short hand at the 12, and the second hand, mean little needle quivered, stuck. That S, when the first sound came from the nursery. A single tap like a teacup set down on a saucer by someone who didn't want to be heard. The mistress flinched. The master didn't. Aunt Morell slid her eyes toward the ceiling, then back to Eden. "Keep that sprig tight," she whispered. "Names like to have something to breathe through." Eden lifted her chin. Her mouth was a steady line. Her hands were not. She stepped into the hall. The master began to descend, slow as syrup, the soles of his shoes whispering against the runner. A draft slipped from under the nursery door, cool and wrong, like cellar air in summer. The mistress took one step back and touched the newel post with 2 fingers, a woman claiming a piece of wood because she couldn't claim a body. After midnight, the mistress said, "Lower now," as requested. Aunt Morell's smile didn't reach her eyes. As required, she answered too soft for anyone but Eden to hear. They reached the landing. The master's door opened on a darkness that seemed awake. Eden's breath shortened, then steadied. On the wall, a portrait of the first Cawthorn tilted itself a fraction, as if trying to listen better. And from the nursery again, that small porcelain tap, followed by the hush of something shifting its weight without needing feet. Midnight still hadn't come. The clock wouldn't allow it. But what waited on the other side of the masteress threshold didn't need permission from a clock. The masteress door swung wider without help. Eden crossed the threshold and felt the air change cooler, denser, like breath held in a jar. She didn't step far. The sprig Aunt Morel had pressed into her palm pricked the skin-small pain, honest and bright. The canopy posts rose like trees around a clearing. On the far wall, a mirror covered with an old shawl, lace yellowed by other midnights. Nathaniel Cawthorne stood beside the bed as if introduced to an unfamiliar shape. He spoke her name like a lock picking itself. Eden. A word that wanted to be both invitation and verdict. Eden kept her eyes. She saw the water glass sweating on the table, a snuffed candle lip gone to smoke, the dark seam in the rug where two pieces didn't quite meet an escape route drawn by thread. She noticed the mattress had a shallow dip already, as though some smaller weight had been there first and recently risen. Below them, the house exhaled beams and boards. Above, the nursery made that tiny porcelain sound again tap, then hush like a child with perfect manners learning how to be heard without punishment. The master's gaze tipped toward the ceiling and came back fast, irritated at his own reaction. He held out a hand, palm up, a lord blessing a vassal or a judge waiting for the oath. Eden didn't move. From the landing, the mistress watched, measured. The candle she gripped bled wax onto her knuckles and she did not flinch. Fear in her wore good posture. Something shifted under the bedcloth, sighing against wood. The master cut his eyes sideways, jaw tight. Eden's breath thinned, then steadied the way a string steadies once a bow finds it. Aunt Morella's voice, remembered not heard. "Keep your eyes. Don't hand them over." "I will stand," Eden said, plain. "I was told to come to the door." She did not say whose order. She let the house answer. The clock in the hall scraped at its stuck second. 11:59 refused to die. A draft from the nursery slid under the threshold like cool milk. The master chose his smile carefully and wore it badly. He made a step. The canopy ringed like faint metal. Eden took in the room one more time, then noticed what should not be there at all. On the pillow, over the embroidered letter C, a small crescent of dust, neat as a fingerprint but too small for any adult. It trembled when she looked at it, as if glad to be seen. From the landing, the mistress's candle went guttering low, then up again, bent by a breath that wasn't hers. At exactly the half-heartbeat between one stuck second and the next, a childish voice, soft, bright, missing its body, counted 1, not midnight. But a beginning no clock could measure. Margaret Cawthorne had learned all her life to fear sudden noise in a quiet house. The first time a cradle fell silent, she became the kind of woman who folds anything that can be folded. Grief, linen, her face. Tonight, the silence up there wasn't empty. It was the kind that has a temperature and touches the back of your neck. She stood on the landing, eyes on Eden and Nathaniel, mine nailed to the door at the top of the stairs. Behind that nursery door waited what she had: a pair of gowns never worn, a rocker that creaked once for every prayer left unanswered. She'd asked Aunt Morel to close that room each morning. The latch never kept. The little brass bell still hung from her wrist, looped by ribbon. She tapped it once with a finger. It did not ring. Metal looked at her and refused. Another place in the house had the bell's attention. From the master's room, she heard Nathaniel say, "The girl will do as she's told." His voice had the shape of control, but it skidded on its own fear. The girl stood tall, not defiant, not docile, simply arranged around herself like a tree that decided where to root. Annoyance, unexpected and bitter, climbed into Margaret's throat. It wasn't Eden she resented. It was the look of someone keeping something the house couldn't confiscate. After midnight, Margaret whispered. It came out like a wish disguised as law. The nursery answered by rocking the empty cradle twice and setting a porcelain cup down without a hand. Downstairs, Aunt Morell's hum resumed a low road the sound could travel. It wasn't a hymn, and it wasn't not. It was the kind of tune that feeds a name. Margaret's skin prickled. She thought of the women whose milk she'd demanded and rationed. Of Mercy, that delicate girl with collarbones like question marks, whose baby Margaret placed for a better household. Of Mercy's eyes afterward no storm, just the look a quiet lake has when it memorizes the sky. The clock's second hand quivered, trapped in its own circle. After midnight, she said again, smaller, to no one she intended to hear. In reply, the covered mirror in Nathaniel's room tugged itself tighter over its nail, as if something on the other side was trying to look out and needed help waiting. A child's voice, that same bell tone, counted. 2. Aunt Morell kept 3 shelves no one else could find. 1 for leaves that heal, 1 for leaves that teach patience, 1 for leaves that teach boundaries. She didn't call it conjure. She called it memory with work to do. Women came to her with hurts doctors didn't have names for hurts given shape by houses like this one. When Margaret married into Cawthorne and brought her North Parlor Manors south, Aunt Morell watched the first baby come and go without getting a name. Watched the mistress hang lace over mirrors so the sorrow wouldn't see itself and settle. Watched the master drink in the years after what he called sleep and what the house called forgetting. Tonight Morell had chosen her song and her sprigs carefully. Rue to sharpen sight, rosemary to keep a path, brick dust to warn a threshold when some feet should not cross. She'd already dusted the nursery doorway that morning, a fine red line. By dusk, something tiny had walked it 8 steps out, 8 steps back, and left no powder disturbed between. Eden, she'd said before the bell, palms warm around the girl's wrists. You are not what they named you, but we can use what they named you. A garden fences itself. Stand inside your fence. Eden had nodded, jaw a knot under her skin. If he comes close, keep your eyes. They'll try to take those first. And keep the sprig whole. If it wilts fast, you open your mouth and say no in a way that lets the house hear you. Some houses only recognize that word if it's fed with breath. On the table, Morell had arranged 3 small cups. 1 with water, 1 with milk, 1 with a bit of sugar caught in molasses. For the scene, for the knot, for the ones in between. She'd set the cups on a folded scrap of muslin she kept for babies who didn't get their welcome. She'd written Mercy's name there once and traced it with her finger when no one was looking. Mercy had died of a fever that was not a fever at all. Men called it accident. Women called it what it was. Margaret called it a sadness that made her ill from the smell of iron. The baby had gone to a house with a brass gate and a colder cradle. Now Morell hummed and listened. The house answered in its joints. The nursery kicked once, twice, then quieted like a shushed smile. From upstairs, a small voice counted 3. Morell set the last cup down and whispered, I hear you. Word travels in a county the way smoke does. Low sure finding the places it's not supposed to reach. Folks near the bend of the river said the Cawthorne house had a midnight it didn't deserve. They said every June, the clock caught and held, and anything cruel a man planned in that pause got seen by something that ate cruelty like sugar. A farmhand swore he'd watched a window frost over in July. A seamstress said she heard a lullaby drift out of an empty room and felt her hands start stitching without thread. Margaret, for her part, knew stories are just a way to ventilate a truth you can stand to keep airtight. She didn't believe. She managed. She managed the ledger of linens, the ledger of menus, the ledger of births and losses as if they were figures that could be balanced by neat entries. She managed Nathaniel S. temper with silence and the helpless fear with lists. Eden, though Eden was a kind of unsorted item in a neat woman S book. The word virgin had made its rounds because men liked to say it like a brand they'd kept polished. Margaret heard the word and felt only the loudness of men naming what wasn't theirs. Tonight that word hung in the air and drew flies. Nathaniel had ordered. Margaret had sent for the girl. Heaven help her, she had. But she'd also waited on the stairs because she could not be in the room where violence wore perfume. The nursery S tap 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 began aligning itself with the stuck heartbeat of the hall clock, and Margaret understood in a place beneath her understanding that she was not the only woman waiting. Below, Aunt Morel S. hum found a harmony not sung by any voice. Sometimes a house will decide it does not want to be an accomplice. Sometimes it will talk through the furniture first. The mirror S shawl in the Master S room twitched again. Behind it, a shape leaned forward, not tall enough to be a man, not smooth enough to be a blessing. The air grew sweet and sour at once like overripe fruit. Margaret thought of the infant gown she'd never had to wash, folded and refolded until the creases remembered pain. Upstairs, a voice with milk still clinging to it counted 4. In the Master S room, Nathaniel took another step that pretended not to be a retreat from what he could not name. The canopy tassels stirred as if someone had brushed past. Eden stayed just inside the doorway where the corridor S dimness could still touch her shoulder. She did not look at Nathaniel S. hands. She looked at his cuff buttons. It is easier to see a man S tells when you watch the places he forgets. "Close the door," he said, and the door, obedient to the wrong master, eased inward on its hinge without her touch. Eden S. palm tightened around the sprig. It did not wilt. She drew breath and smelled beneath starch, and candle smoke milk just turned. Iron clean as a blade, lavender that had not grown this year. She knew then. The room was set for someone else's bedtime. A sound came from under the bed, small feet finding a board no living foot remembered. Eden kept her eyes and said, "Lo, I see you." She wasn't talking to Nathaniel. He mistook it for consent and smiled like a man walking through his own barn with a lantern and not noticing the hay. Stamp. The mattress sighed and sank, as if a child had climbed up and settled cross-legged with important work. Nathaniel S. mouth opened. He couldn't command what he couldn't see. Fear put his hand out before he could think, and it passed through air that pushed back like water. From the landing, Margaret heard him draw in breath like he'd touched ice. She stepped forward, 2 shoes soft against the runner, then stopped as if the newel post had spoken her name sharply. "Do you feel it?" Eden asked the bed, not the man. The bed answered by tugging the coverlet smooth with a small, precise stroke no grown hand would make. Nathaniel took one more step, and the candle on his table went out without smoke. In the dark, something rearranged itself with the sound of linen whispered against linen. The child voice at the ceiling, sunny and patient, counted 5. Midnight would not come, but something like a weather front did. A pressure change, a taste on the teeth, the sense that breathing was now a shared activity. Margaret tightened her grip on the candle and entered, the flame listing like a ship. Nathaniel didn't look at her. He was looking at the bed the way a man looks at a road that has decided to be a river. I told the girl, he began and stopped. What words could govern a bed making room for a guest he hadn't invited? Eden stood straight. Shadow poured long behind her like ink. She was young, yes, but there was an oldness in the way she kept the line of her shoulders. The sprig in her palm was still green. Margaret noticed absurdly that Eden's apron hem was even, a thing done carefully in a life where care was rarely repaid. The coverlet creased, then smoothed again. A small handprint dust pail appeared for one breath and rose like a wave canceled. From the nursery, the rocker began to move, not the wild arc of panic, but the steady sway of a woman with time and a song. Margaret felt something inside her, something she'd folded and folded, try to sit up in its drawer. Nathaniel said her name. Margaret. Not command, not plea, surprise. As if he'd expected the house to frighten his wife elsewhere. She stepped to the sideboard and set the candle down. The wick flared, cratered, corrected itself. "Do you want this?" she asked Eden. And she meant the room, the shape of this power, the gaze of a man who never learned to be seen. Eden, eyes still on what no one could quite see, answered without a blink. "I did not come to want." 6, a voice counted gently from a height no child should have to speak from. The county reverend liked to be called to dinner when the roast was pink. He liked words that polished the air and the sound of his own ring on the table. But the Cawthorn summons tonight wasn't a place to set a napkin. It was Margaret's cell voice at the door flat, even requesting that he advise the household at once. He brought his book and his confidence and arrived to find the front door open on a room full of quiet furniture with better manners than he had. Aunt Morell watched him cross the hall and thought, uncharitably and accurately, man who has never lost anything but time. She did not stop humming. She added a harmony under her breath that made his book's spine itch. "What is the trouble?" he asked, standing with his hat pinned in the crook of his arm like a shield. Margaret tipped her chin toward the stairs. "Night," she said by way of answer, "not darkness." "Night." He looked blank. She started up, and because even cowards go where a lady leads, he followed. They found Nathaniel in a truce with the bed he'd purchased and believed he owned. Eden stood at the door as if keeping watch over something that couldn't watch itself. The Reverend opened his book, and the house snickered, just the faintest creak in a far wall, but a snicker all the same. "We don't require your words," Aunt Morell said from the threshold, voice respectful enough to keep the peace, edged enough to be true. "We require your ears." The Reverend, unused to that arrangement, stiffened, then read anyway, strings of syllables polished by decades of indifferent use. The house listened politely the way a storm listens to a spoon tapping a window. In the middle of one saintess name, the cradle in the nursery drifted forward a finger's width and paused, as if nodding to someone tall and patient. The Reverend swallowed his next sentence. He had seen enough funerals to recognize when a room did not belong to the living alone. 7, said the bright voice at the ceiling. The Reverend shut his book because he wasn't sure which chapter covered arithmetic done by air. There is a kind of courage that doesn't look like a raised chin or a voice made loud. It looks like a girl adjusting her grip on a sprig, breathing once, and stepping half a pace deeper into a room haunted by a truth that refuses to be buried again. Eden did that. The bed's quiet visitor did not startle. Whatever had come wanted to be witnessed, not appeased. "Mercy," Aunt Morell said, not loudly, not to the wrong ear. Margaret heard the name like she'd stepped on a needle she'd dropped months ago and forgotten to sweep. Nathaniel looked up, uncomprehending. Eden didn't blink. "Mercy," she echoed, and the covered mirror tried very hard to be still. Once, not long after a birth that ended in linen folded too neatly, Margaret had walked the quarters with a ledger and a plan. Mercy had had milk enough for 2 and browsed her baby's eyelashes with her thumb as if reading a book. Margaret had made a case as tidy as cake slices. She'd placed the child in a white house with a blue porch where no lullaby would ever be sung in the right key. Mercy had said very little. The little she said, Margaret had not let herself hear. It was not a crime against God, she'd told herself then. It was a favor to the well-arranged world. Tonight, the well-arranged world showed her the bill. Under the bed, bare feet patted once like a child impatient at adults arguing. The brick, dust line at the nursery door glowed the way old coals glow when someone stirs them. Eden's face softened not with pity but with recognition. She understood the difference between a haunting that wants revenge and a haunting that wants its name said correctly. 8, the voice said, and this time even Nathaniel, who had never learned to count anything he couldn't sell, felt the number pull at him like a tide. Margaret's hand went to her throat, finding pearls that suddenly seemed like teeth strung on a dare. I did not kill that child, she said to the room, to Aunt Morell, to herself. I found her a place. The words had a shape she'd smoothed on the tongue so many times. Still, they hurt on the way out, like bread too stale to swallow. Aunt Morell didn't argue. Arguments are for the living. She only set her 3 cups on the mistress dresser. Water, milk, sweet, and the air made a decision. A small, not yet toddler sigh warmed the milk's skin. The water stilled so completely it felt like a mirror even under cloth. The sweet went glossy as if licked by a careful mouth. Eden looked to Margaret. Where? Not accusation, geography. If you want to bring somebody home, you have to know which road they were sent down. Margaret's answer caught on a sob she didn't know she'd been carrying. 2 counties, she said. White Gate. An oleander hedge. Name, Aunt Morell said softly. Annalise, Margaret whispered, and the nursery breathed in. Annalise. The one pushed across a threshold by hands that believed in their own goodness. The one who drank from a bottle that smelled like boiled linen and not like her mother. The one who learned a lullaby with wrong words and cried anyway. Until she didn't tea. Houses keep these names the way rivers keep coins. Annalise, Eden repeated. We see you. The mirroress shawl slipped a full inch. Child-sized fingers pressed against the inside of the glass and left no print, only a pressure that made the lace doilies on the dresser tremble. Nathaniel swore under his breath, but it was the sort of oath men use when they have reached the edge of their vocabulary and found no bridge. 9, sang the small voice, and behind it came a second, a twin harmony you only hear when 2 women say the same name for different reasons. After midnight, Margaret had said, as if permission were a key. But clocks dawn to police justice. They only time it. The second hand stuttered, lifted an impossible, improper, skipped. The hall clock chimed once on a note no one had taught it. Not 12. Not any number you could show a child on your fingers. Nathaniel backed away from his own bed. Get it out, he told the Reverend, as if the man were a broom. The Reverend looked at Aunt Morell and decided for tonight that survival meant following her lead. Annalise, Morell said, pouring a little milk into the sweet. You were passed over a hedge that poisoned dogs. We are sorry for the fence. We are sorry for the song with the wrong words. We are sorry for the door you thought was a wall. She set the cup on the floor. It slid politely under the bed without being touched. Eden's sprig dampened at the tips. She lifted it to her lips and breathed through it the way a woman breathes through cloth when smoke tries to climb in her mouth. She turned to the bed and said something that wasn't language but was entirely intelligible. A tone that meant I will not be broken tonight and I will not be eaten. And I recognize the work you came to do. The bed accepted the terms. The coverlet rose, settled, and left a smoothness where a small body might have lain its head. Margaret stepped closer than she would have chosen to anything she feared and looked. It is a particular agony to see what your choices look like from the other side. She saw it. She didn't faint. Penances that matter are done awake. The hall clock, offended and compelled, drew breath and agreed to chime. It struck once, twice, then stumbled and rang a 13th note, thin as a ribbon, sharp as a bone. 10, the voice counted, cheerful as a game played well past bedtime. The house had been holding its loudest memory back the way a mother holds her own cry until the baby is asleep. Now it let it out. The nursery door drifted open the smallest distance a good latch can allow. Cold air rolled out with a sweetness under it that made the Reverend close his eyes and think of bread and grief in the same mouthful. Nathaniel tried command again. Men will try command with their last breath. Enough, he said to the bed, to his wife, to history. The bed, full of someone else's schedule, ignored him. He rounded on Aunt Morel. This is your work. Morel took that like a badge and like a threat. No, she said, even with mercy for the syllable. This is your arithmetic coming home with its sums. Eden turned her face toward the open slice of nursery and felt something like a breeze pluck a piece of hair from her cheek. Not unkind, curious. She remembered Aunt Morel's counsel. Houses will tell you what they are if you let them name themselves. Who else? Eden asked gently, as if tucking a question into a blanket. The rocker answered with a lazy creak. The tiny porcelain sound, the cup on the saucer, came again, this time joined by the whisper of paper, a birth record that never got written, making itself anyway. In the corridor, Margaret's throat opened and the truth came out with a sound like a chair sliding back from a table. I sent 2, she said, and 60 pounds of pearls fell off her conscience and landed on the floor without making a sound. 11, the child said, and the house leaned in like a listener about to hum the last line of a hymn everyone knows without remembering how they learned it. The 13th chime hung in the hall like a thin moon. It didn't fade, it took up residence. Margaret felt it touch the softest part of her ear and travel, warm and humiliating, down her neck. She looked at Eden and did something she had never been taught to do in any drawing room. She apologized, not as performance, not as transaction, but as surgery. I am sorry. It was the kind of sorry that bleeds. Eden heard the words. She let them exist. She did not make it easier. Mercy's name had been said. Annalise's name had been said. The house, satisfied that language had finally done a fraction of its work, set about doing the rest. The bed gave a little bounce, playful, if such a thing can be, to show it was done being furious for tonight. The nursery door closed to a sliver and latched. The covered mirror calmed. The air warmed the way a cheek warms after a tear dries. Nathaniel took a step. The floor refused it and creaked like a warning. He stopped. For the first time since his father showed him how to sign a name across the bottom of a man, he looked uncertain about his own outline. Aunt Morel picked up the cups. The milk was gone. The water had a thumbprint S ripple. The sweet had a dent like a kiss. She smiled, and because living is also required, looked to Eden. You did not hand over your eyes, she said. Eden nodded once. The sprig in her palm, finally having done its work, wilted as softly as a sigh. Margaret stepped backward into a life that would not be nearly as tidy as she'd made it look. I will go to the gate with the oleander, she said. I will ask for what can be returned. I will ask for what cannot to be forgiven. By whom? The Reverend asked, voice small as any man's when the room stops pretending he runs it. By the names, Aunt Morel said, and that was sermon enough. The hall clock's hands moved at last. Midnight arrived, not to begin anything terrible, but to end the pause where truth had forced itself in. Outro as requested in the spirit of your example. If this night unsettled you, good. It means the house did its work. The ledgers we inherit don't always match the ones we keep, and sometimes the only clock that matters is the one that refuses to move until a name is said right. Do you believe a house can hold a grudge? Or is it just holding memory until we can? Tell us where you are watching from. If it is your first time here at Tales Never Told, subscribe for more stories that polite history hides behind lace. Like the video if the 13th chime reached you, and in the comments tell me, what would you ask of a door that opens on its own? Morning is supposed to fix things by making them visible. This morning made everything sharper. The nursery chill had gone, but the Rocker S runners left faint tracks where no dust should cling. Margaret didn't send for Eden. She sent for the carriage. 2 counties, she told the driver. White gate, oleander hedge. She did not dress for company, she dressed for confession. Eden scrubbed the kitchen table until wood smelled like tree again. Aunt Morel brewed a pot of tea that never boiled, it just hummed, and poured 1 cup for Eden. 1 for herself, and 1 for the space between them occupied by every woman they'd ever known who'd had to breathe through cloth. Men will call it delusion, Morel said, eyes on the vapor the 3rd cup made without rising. Women will call it Tuesday. Eden didn't smile. Some girls grow old in one night, others choose not to. If he calls again? She asked. He won tea, Morel said. Not because he learned gentleness, because the house doesn't like to repeat itself when it has been heard. He'll look for other ways. We'll be listening. On the road, Margaret watched hedges blur into one green argument. She had never arrived at a gate without an invitation in her life. She instructed the driver to stop anyway. A woman with shoulders like work opened. She looked at Margaret as if measuring a dress she might decline to sew. Name? Annalise, Margaret said, and the woman's face softened like dough under a palm. We don't rename here, she said. It was neither boast nor threat. It was a rule that had cost something to write. I have nothing to trade, Margaret said. Only a ledger to balance that I should never have kept. Back at the house, the hall clock kept admirable time, embarrassed by last night's honesty. Nathaniel walked his own porch like a boundary he no longer trusted. He didn't look at Eden. That was new. Not respect, not yet. But not possession either. In some histories, not is a good beginning. The kitchen door clicked. The rocker upstairs sighed, once content for now. Somewhere in the walls, a small voice, milk-warm and increasingly at ease in this world, counted. 1, as if to start a new game where the rules had changed. In the weeks that followed, the County S stories did what stories do. They changed their clothes and went visiting. Some said the mistress went to a house with a blue porch and came back without her pearls. Some said the master stopped sleeping under his own roof, preferring the little bed in his office where paper kept him company and the bed didn't he. Some said the girl with the Bible name had made the bed float and the clock sing. The truth, as ever, was quieter and heavier. Margaret returned with a bundle held like a flame she intended to stay warm and not scorch. Not a baby, a dress, a little cap, a page with a name carefully inked and a line through it like a river corrected. They wouldn't give her, she told Aunt Morel, because she isn't theirs to give. She belongs to herself. Morel nodded. That sentence had healed more women than any tonic. What did they give? Eden asked, eyes on the cap, fingers twitching to iron it and refusing to the wrinkle was a relic. Instructions, Margaret said, for asking, for sending, for atoning without expecting applause. Nathaniel listened from a room over. He hated the word atonement because it smelled like losing, and he hadn't learned yet that sometimes loss is the only road to keeping anything worth having. He slept with the door open and woke once to the soft pad of feet. No weight dented his mattress. He said a man's prayer into a pillow and received a child's silence in return. The rocker upstairs found a rhythm that matched Aunt Morella's hum some afternoons. Eden took to pausing at the nursery door not to look, but to be looked at by a kindness that had finally found a right angle in this house. She whispered the names Mercy, Annalise like oiling a hinge. The door swung easier. The hall clock never stuck again on the last night of June. It saved its 13th chime for storms when men raised their voices. It rang at once when the overseer tried to bring a whip into the kitchen and found the lash in 2 pieces before he touched the threshold. 2, said the house some evenings just for the pleasure of counting aloud. Justice does not always look like a marshal on a horse. Sometimes it looks like a gate visited, a name restored, and a bed that never again invites what it cannot consent to. Nathaniel S. Power learned a draft. He spoke less in commands and more in noises that made the room wait. He had not become good, but he had become observed. For some men, that is salvation's first rung. Margaret S. hair went a little gray in the space of a month. Not from haunting, from maintenance, from the hard housekeeping of remaking a house that had never been asked to be kind. She removed the shawl from the nursery mirror and let it show her what she had kept folded. The woman reflected there didn't look like a villain. She looked like a person who had used the tools she'd been handed and now had to learn other ones slower with softer handles. Eden grew into her name by rewriting it. Gardens keep out what would chew them down. They also make room for volunteer plants that arrive on the wind and turn out to feed you. She learned to walk her own edges. The men who said virgin stopped saying it where sound could reach her skin. They learned to say Eden like they'd found the sign on a fence and read it. Aunt Morell slept sometimes with the milk cup on her table and woke to find it empty and set back just so. She said, "You are welcome," into the morning and meant it. The Reverend sent a pie by his wife, who wrote a note that read, "You were right," and underlined nothing. Ears learn slower than mouths. On a late afternoon that smelled like cut grass and iron cooling, a woman came to the back door holding the hand of a girl with a ribbon tied too tightly. Annalise asked to see where the rocking came from, the woman said. Calm as a field, dangerous as one if you misread it. Margaret stood in her own doorway and made room where there hadn't been any. She had practiced the kinds of silence that let another woman speak. Upstairs, the rocker didn't creak, it listened. Sometimes love is that. Years pass in the way a river walks, forward but always with a memory for where it touched the bank. The Cawthorne place grew quieter in the right ways and louder in the necessary ones. Children, some born in the quarters, some visiting from past decisions made better, learned to count on the stairs and ran their palms along the banister until it shone like a confession polished honestly. Nathaniel died when men like him often do. Not punished by lightning, simply reduced by the arithmetic of a body that had always expected service and finally struck. Folks said his last word was a number 13, which feels poetic if you like that sort of thing. More likely he said Margaret because bad men are ordinary most when they die. The house did not gloat. It does not suit a structure to be petty. Rot handles that. Margaret lived long enough to teach other women with tight collars how to knock on gates without invitations, and how to speak names without asking permission first. She still arranged flowers with precision. She simply put them where the light reached them and not where the parlor demanded. On June nights, she listened for the clock and found only steady time. She found that steadiness scarier and braver than the haunting had been. Eden married a man who liked mending things. She did not take his name because she had learned in a house that measured women like linen that names are a kind of fence you choose. They had children who learned the difference between no as a wall and no as a door you lock at night because you love who sleeps inside. When those children visited Aunt Morel, they hummed without prompting. The cups on Morella's table sometimes shifted themselves a hair, as if acknowledging attendance. Come autumn, when the oak shed leaves fat as hands, the house exhaled a last bit of old air and took in new. The nursery S-rocker, now well used by babies who stayed, made no more midnight sermons. But on certain evenings when someone new learned to tell the truth out loud, it would give two approving creaks. People said the sound meant yes. And if you stood late by the hall clock and put your ear to its throat, you'd hear not ticking but counting. Always up, never over.